Hello and welcome to Claris Engage. I'm Melissa Ann and I will be your host today for the online demand session, Accessing the Cloud Through Accessibility. Okay, in this session we will cover 5 categories of discussion for accessibility as a FileMaker developer. First, we're going to look at regulations, being accessibility timeline. This is kind of the history. So we'll look at the past, present, and even the future of the regulations for accessibility. Then we're going to look at the WCAG, which is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Then we'll look at the Section 508, which is the federal side of accessibility guidelines and regulations. Then we'll look at what we call POUR, P-O-U-R. Those are the 4 areas that these regulations evaluate. Then we'll head over to the disability types and we'll have some discussion about blindness, low vision, being colorblind, deaf, cognitive, and mobility. After that, we'll look at design and we'll see how color, text, buttons, tabs, sliders, and much more all affect those individuals with disabilities. And then lastly, we'll look at testing. We'll look at and discuss what it looks like to test for color contrast, color blindness, tabbing, testing your preview and print options, screen readers, and of course the most important, your user testing. Then we'll head over to resources. Here I will provide you links to tools and resources you will personally need to develop and create a culture where accessibility has a seat at the table with you. And then we'll go to our recap, where we will talk a little bit about the takeaways from our time together. I think it's important before we actually move into the history of the regulations for accessibility to kind of get a grasp of how big this is with regard to how many people are affected by disabilities and why we need to make things accessible and what our role is in all of this. So there are 1 billion, basically the equivalent of 15% of the world's population, that experiences some form of disability on a daily basis. Apple themselves has accessibility as one of their 6 core values. Plus, Claris has joined in that core value by combining the mindset of being both future-focused plus being agile and being passionate. This mindset enables and facilitates Claris's vision to make powerful technologies available to everyone. As developers, we have a social responsibility to ensure the systems we design are not the stumbling block to this vision and allowing everyone access. Okay, let's now go over to the history of regulations. And in 1947, the Federal Acquisition Regulations was established, also known as FAR. The purpose of FAR was to establish codification and publication of uniform policies and procedures for acquisition by all of the United States federal executive agencies. In 1973, the Rehabilitation Act was put in place. The Rehabilitation Act was the first major legislative effort to secure an equal playing field for individuals with disabilities. Also in 1973, they included Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act was the first civil legislation to protect individuals with disabilities. The non-discrimination requirements of the law apply to employers and organizations that receive federal financial assistance with regard to Section 504. Section 504, their message is very concise. It says, no other qualified individual with a disability in the United States shall solely be reason of her or his disability be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefit of, or be subject to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. So what does this really mean? It means that any program receiving federal funds may not discriminate against those with disabilities based on their disability status. All government agencies, federally funded projects This could also include funding for systems, K1 or K through 12 schools, post-secondary entities, state colleges, universities, and vocational training schools all fall under this category. Section 508 in 1986 was established and added to the Rehabilitation Act, and Section 508 was added to the Rehabilitation Act to require federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology, also known as EIT, accessible to people with disabilities. In 2008, the WCAG 2.0 was released. The WCAG 2.0 was developed through the World Wide Web Consortium, also known as W3C, an international community where member organizations, a full-time staff, and also the public work together to develop web standards. The WCAG 2.0 refers to the Web Accessibility Initiative that you should know about, which is the WAI that the W3C published. It's a little bit complicated. So what's the purpose of this? The WCAG 2.0 was designed to apply broadly to different web technologies now and in the future, and to be testable with a combination of automated testing and human evaluation. In 2016, it was understood that they were going to need some more robust guidelines for the future based on the rapid development of technologies. So that's when in 2016 the Silver Task Force was established. And Silver Task Force was created and authorized by the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, to do the advanced work for a major revision that would be the successor to the WCAG 2. And they're taking quite a new approach. The approach to developing these new guidelines will be different in the fact that they will be implementing the user experience model to develop this structure, also the framework and the information or guidelines for this content. AG 3.0 equals basically silver. And what this means is that the W3C Accessibility Guidelines Working Group is anticipating that these new guidelines that they will be releasing and they are establishing currently, that those guidelines will go beyond just web content, and therefore they will be dropping the WC for web content and just leaving it as AG 3.0, as you can tell here, and hence codename Silver. So what's the current status of Silver guidelines? The Silver Task Force has currently finished their research, design, requirements, initial training modules, and are in the process with moving the existing WCAG content into their new structure. So what does this mean? It means a new form, standard, and enforcement is coming our way. If you and your company are not already familiar with the accessibility guidelines, this is absolutely the perfect time to open the conversation on how you can bake accessibility into your company culture. In 2018, the 2.1 was implemented as an update to the 2.0 for this WCAG for the interim while Silver guidelines are being developed. Nothing in the 2.0 was removed or undone. The 2.1 simply adds additional criteria and guidelines. These additions were that they added 17 additional success criteria to address both mobile accessibility, people with low vision, and people with cognitive and learning disabilities. Those categories were not in the original 2.0 and now are in the guidelines. 2.2 release. Sometime before Silver is released, the 2.2 is scheduled to release, which is probably around November of 2020, as an interim to updating these guidelines to meet the changing technologies. Also in 2018, the Section 508 received a refresh. The refresh was an update deployed to incorporate the changes made in the 2.1 as they would apply to the federal side with regard to federal agencies. The Silver draft release. The Silver roadmap indicates an anticipated publishing sometime in 2021. That's when we can expect to kind of start seeing many more details of what these new accessibility guidelines will be and how they're going to enforce them. And then right now, the first release for Silver is currently targeted for November of 2022. Okay, so now let's talk about the WCAG, also known as Silver, or moving into the Silver guidelines. And the question is, why do you need to understand the WCAG guidelines as a FileMaker developer? And the first reason being that we as developers, again, have a social responsibility to develop systems that embrace all humans. The other reason is that WebDirect allows users access through web browsers, and that's where the WCAG guidelines apply. In addition, there has been a 177% jump in the number of web accessibility lawsuits filed in federal court over 2 years, and that's according to a disability rights lawyer that is very well known in the community. And then lastly, new guidelines and regulations are coming. So now is absolutely the time to start getting informed and preparing to implement accessibility into your company culture. Let's now take a look at Section 508. And when might Section 508 apply to the systems developed using FileMaker, is the question. The answer is, if the system is being used by federal agencies, that's when you need to apply the Section 508. So let's look at this a little bit more. Section 508.gov indicates that the Section 508 requires federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology, EIT, accessible to people with disabilities. It also states that the law applies to all federal agencies when they develop, procure, maintain, or use electronic and information technology. In addition, under Section 508, agencies must give disabled employees and members of the public access to the information comparable to the access available to others. So let's look a little bit deeper. Here's another question. Are there exceptions to these guidelines for Section 508? The answer is yes, there are exceptions. Again, under Section 508.gov, a full list is available of these exceptions, and how to evaluate what qualifies as an exception is also detailed in the standards under the E202 general exceptions. It should also be noted, though, that if you are a federal agency or working with a federal agency, you do need to refer to your agency's accessibility policy to identify when formal approval by an agency representative is required to claim any of these exceptions. That should be carefully noted. Moving on now over to the evaluation process of these guidelines and regulations, and let's now take a look at the 4 areas both the WCAG and Section 508 evaluate for compliance using the acronym POUR, P-O-U-R. The first, perceivable. Second, operable. U, understandable, and R is for robust. Let's take a look at these individually now. Perceivable. Information and user interface components must be presentable to users in ways that they can perceive, meaning the user must be able to perceive the information being presented. An example of this is the human using the system needs to be able to input the information into their brain so that they can process it. If the information can't get into their brain because of a technology obstacle, then it's definitely considered inaccessible. Operable is basically user interface components and navigation must be operable. The meaning, the human must be able to operate the interface. The interface cannot require interactions that a user cannot perform. An example of this is a human who is reliant on a keyboard only and cannot use their mouse due to loss of vision must be able to access the same information a sighted person would access with the mouse. Okay? The next one is understandable. The information and the operation of the user interface must be understandable, meaning the human must be able to understand the information as well as the operation of the user interface. The content or operation cannot be beyond their understanding. An example of this is using plain and concise words in the language that you use. Lastly is the robust. It basically means that content must be robust enough that it can be interpreted reliably by a wide variety of user agents, including assistive technologies. This meaning the human must be able to access the content as technologies advance. As technologies and user agents evolve, the content should remain accessible. An example, readers, which are the screen readers for the visually impaired, are continually evolving, which I'll show you examples of that in a minute. And access using the newer technologies will absolutely be important. So at this point, you might be having the question of, well, what to expect? What should we expect to see when Silver is released? Okay, what's the big change? And so let's take a look at that. The first and the primary thing is that the standard levels will change. They will be going up. The grading criteria will be increasing and be more strict and have more guidelines, obviously. But both the current and future standard will continue to be based on a tiered level for grading compliance, okay? As you can tell on the left-hand side, this is the current grading levels. It's a level A, double A, and a triple A. Most people design at a level of a double A, but honestly, at this moment in time, because of the increase in guidelines, everyone should be designing to the standard of a triple A, not a double A. A double A level right now is the primary standard, the lowest standard for anything that is on the federal side of things. And so you can anticipate that that is going to go up to a triple A level, which will then be the silver. And in some cases for low vision, will move up to the gold standard. And as you can see, it is anticipated that level A will drop out as now being inaccessible. The last part of the regulations section that we have is what I've labeled as application. And it's basically like, what's the application process of applying these regulations? Like, where do we even start? And so what does it look like to apply these regulations to the systems we build in FileMaker? So let's take a look at that for a second. The first place we definitely have to start is with empathy. And empathy is basically our ability or capacity to see and understand what another person is experiencing from within their frame of reference. In other words, it's our capacity to put ourselves in another person's position or shoes. So that's definitely where we have to start, is with the empathy. And then we need to also move on, and we need to combine two other thoughts of thinking with the empathy, and that is design thinking and system thinking. And design thinking is the creative problem solving, where solutions are definitely focused on the human who will be interacting with the system. And then this is because when we focus on the people we are creating for, we create better product, services, and definitely better processes. And then we have to combine system thinking. And system thinking takes both our linear and our logical thought into development to an enhanced level of approaching system builds with a holistic approach to integrations or evaluating multiple parts, and it could even be multiple moving parts. But this is what helps us solve very complex problems. And when we combine these, when we combine the empathy, the design, and the system thinking all as one, it helps us reach the goal of really creating digital transformation for all humans to enjoy. So let's start with the empathy process, like I talked about, by first taking a look at the different areas of disabilities. And let's start with blindness. Individuals who are blind rely on the keyboard and or voice input to move through technology to access information or to complete a task. Keyboard access is imperative for all technology within a system for a blind user, as they do not use a mouse to access information and complete a task. I would challenge you at this moment to shut your eyes and try to use your computer with just your keyboard. It's very challenging, if not impossible, for some of us. But it is imperative to someone that is blind. Individuals who are blind also rely on screen readers to tell them where they are in a system or a page and how to complete a task. Also, both mobile devices and computers have built-in accessibility readers and tools. Interesting fact number 1 of 2 to think about is that 90% of individuals, I'll let that sink in for a second, 90% of individuals who are visually impaired or blind use the Chrome web browser to access their information and online applications. 90% of visually impaired people are using the Chrome web browser. That is a very big deal, and I think I'll be able to prove that to you as we move forward. The Chrome web browser is also so highly used by the impaired because of the Chrome reader that it provides. And this is quickly surpassing and replacing all previous screen readers. So the fact is that when we have 90% of visually impaired or people with disabilities using the Chrome reader, and they're doing it through the web, this just supports the benefits and the future thinking of developing systems for the cloud with web-based deployment giving access to everyone. That's just a really big deal for us to reach people. Interesting fact number 2 to think about, and that is 70% of individuals who are visually impaired or blind are underemployed or unemployed. So again, this is not a small number. 70% of individuals who are visually impaired or blind are underemployed or unemployed. So as you and I today and in the future reflect back on the COVID-19 pandemic, where the unemployment rate reached 14%, I personally feel that this has given us an opportunity, a unique opportunity, to experience what individuals with disabilities deal with daily with regard to unemployment. Society during the COVID-19 has gone through incredible difficulties due to unemployment rate of 14%. The visually and blind deal with on a daily basis a 70% unemployment rate. I personally feel that 70% unemployment rate is unacceptable, and that we can help reduce this number by developing systems that are accessible for everyone. So by partnering with the future thinking of the cloud, combined with web deployment, we basically as developers have an awesome opportunity to play an active role in really making a difference. So moving on from blindness to the next category of visually impaired is low vision. And one of the statistics for low vision is that 1 out of 6 persons over the age of 40 struggles with low vision. Low vision can range from age-related degeneration to loss of vision, either centered or peripheral, blurred vision, generalized haze, light sensitivity, or even night blindness can play a role with low vision. Using font sizes and colors that make the level AAA standard are important areas to pay attention to when you're designing for low vision. That is definitely more so why the AAA level was created, was for the low vision, among others, but primarily there. Dark and light mode also play a role when designing for low vision. Dark mode, the pupil contracts and dilates to allow more light in, which allows better focus with the eye becoming tired when reading. And then lastly, the zoom. Zoom capability also plays a role for low vision users when needing to enlarge the content on a page to read. Usually you want to give them at least the capacity to zoom at minimum 200%. With regard to color blindness, as we move on to that category, it's estimated that there are 300 million colorblind people in the world. 98% of all colorblind people are not colorblind, but they're actually just color deficient. 95% of the colorblind community are actually men. And then 98% of those with color blindness have red and green color deficiency. And I'll show you those deficiencies when we move into the design and testing. And then symbols, contrasting colors, and textures definitely play an important role in color blindness and how you design. As we take a look at the area of being deaf, it's estimated that there are 446 million people in the world who are either deaf or suffer from some form of hearing loss. 1 in 8 people in the United States over 12 years of age actually has hearing loss in both ears. And then ensuring all audible content and alerts are also displayed during visual text to the user is definitely critical for the hearing impaired with regard to how you design your systems. So let's now take a look at the cognitive part of this. And this cognitive was one of the areas that was added to the 2.1 refresh as one of the 17 criteria. And basically the terminology for the different categories and conditions for cognitive impairment really vary. And they do include intellectual disabilities, development disabilities, and learning disabilities. Some of the examples that fall under the category of cognitive include, again, learning disabilities, ADD, ADHD, autism, spectrum disorder, mental health, memory impairment, multiple sclerosis, neurocognitive functioning, and even seizure disorders as examples. It's definitely important to remember that cognitive learning and neurological disabilities, they do not necessarily affect the intelligence of a person. And we need to remember that when we work with people. And then lastly, clearly structuring the content that you're providing the user, and then labeling forms and buttons, providing predictable link targets, functionality, and overall interaction will help support individuals with cognitive difficulties. Another area that you can help support that is ensuring that enough white space in your system is available to reduce the cognitive load. Lastly, in the area of disabilities, we have the area of mobility. And mobility is also known as motor disabilities, which are physical, including weakness and limitations of muscular control. Mobility disabilities can be such as involuntary movements, including tremors, lack of coordination or paralysis, limitations of sensations, joint disorders such as arthritis, like when using a mouse or keypad or keyboard, and then pain that impedes movement and missing limbs. Individuals who have mobility disabilities may require the use of special keyboards, head pointers, mouse sticks, food-operated switches, and even the voice recognition software and others. One of the things to remember with mobility disabilities and designing for them is that providing larger areas to click or to type definitely helps these individuals in this category, as they are more likely to make mistakes when typing or clicking. All right, so now that we've looked at disabilities, let's move over into the design elements for disabilities and accessibility. And the one thing that I'd like to emphasize and encourage you in is that if you design for accessibility, you will absolutely design an overall better experience for all of your users, not just those that need accessibility. It will create a much better experience for all of the users. So let's head on over to color and take a look at that. And let's talk about two areas with regard to color, and that's going to be emotion and contrast. So first, going over to emotion, and different colors evoke different emotions, okay? And so the first example is that the color blue. Blue is a perfect example of how color is used to evoke emotion, as it's used to help relax the cognitive stimuli. Some schools even use blue overlays on the lighting to help relax their students. Blue is a color that it's also used to reduce the amount of anxiety and tensions experienced when someone is using electronic devices. This is called technostress, and it, yes, is a real thing. Another way that we use color, not necessarily with emotion, but it kind of has to do with it. It's about the visual aspects of it, of how it gives us a positive or a negative in a situation. Is color actually giving meaning to the context of something? And so let's look at an example of that. This is just a true and false question, really simple, but it is completely inaccessible. It's an inaccessible design. And the reason for this is, let's take a look, is because although this is very clear to someone with normal vision which answer they got correct or wrong, someone who is colorblind is unable or may be unable to see the difference between the colors. So let's take a look at it from a colorblind view. So somebody that has a red and green deficiency, those two colors completely just disappeared and it is one color. They have no indicator of knowing if they marked the question wrong or right. And so that is what makes it inaccessible, okay? But let's take a look at what it would look like if it was done as being accessible. And that is the same situation here. We still have the red and the green, but we have added icons. And so let's take a look at this. And basically, the visual indicators that we've added allow the colorblind user to easily differentiate between which answer they got wrong or right without the visual color cues that a normal vision person would use. And so again, let's take a look at it from their perspective. So again, they don't need to see the color now because we've given them alternative visual cues. So let's take a look at another one. This is another example of inaccessible design, and that's because in this, the instructions basically say all highlighted fields are required. And we have a yellow highlighted area. But here's the thing, it is inaccessible because although this is very clear to someone with normal vision which fields need to be completed because of the highlighting, as indicated by the yellow highlighting, a colorblind person may not be able to see this highlighting. So let's look at it from their perspective. So you can see just the slightest color variation between the white and the gray. It's even hard for me as a normal vision user to see the difference between the two. I probably would tell you I could not tell the difference. And so that's what they see. And that's why it would be considered inaccessible design. So let's take a look at it from what it would be acceptable as accessible design. And that is that we would have done two things here. We would have changed the instructions and we've added these. And so let's actually go into the reason here. The visual indicators allow the colorblind user to easily differentiate between which fields correlated to fields they are not able to see as being highlighted, ensuring that they know which fields are required. So let's again look from their perspective. So again, that color highlighting is gone, but because of the changing of the language that we used in the instructions, we told them to look for the asterisk, and then on top of it, we added the word that it is required, so they also know that. So that's what it looks like with regard to the emotion side of it, and how those things can get somebody really confused with a positive or a negative in a situation where that's the indicator, the color is the indicator to them of how to move forward or so forth. So the second area to look at with regard to color is contrast. And color contrasting plays a much larger role than most people think when it comes to designing for accessibility. The wrong color contrasting can actually make visuals and content or text disappear to someone who is colorblind. So let's take a look at what this looks like. This is an example of a color combination that is considered inaccessible and does not pass. The first reason for this is that for someone who can only see in black and white, the sections differentiated by color for a non-colorblind user have disappeared, making them unaware of the designation of separation or separate content areas. So you can see where the orange and the blue were, they just look like one. So if you were trying to separate and let somebody know by color different sections, these color combinations are not acceptable or would not pass. The second reason is that the color contrast between the background and the foreground, they don't hit any of the levels. And I'll explain these levels to you here, but this is where we're checking for a AA, a AAA. There's a difference between an 18 point and over and under, and then also a black and white variation. The same in this case applies with the blue side. So another thing is this, let's take a look at what all of the different colors would see. So when you're looking at color blindness, obviously you have the red and green in this area, and you can tell that there's more red and green differentiation or confusion than there is yellow and blue. The monochromo, as you can tell in this example, this is what they would see, which we just showed that example, and then partially. Okay. So let's go and head over to what it looks like to be accessible. In order to make those colors accessible, we would need to change them to this kind of a color combination. And here's why they're accessible now. You can clearly see between the two. So by changing the background color hue and the foreground for the text color contrast, they all met all three standards, the A, AA, and the AAA for the grading. And now the colorblind user can now see a clear distinction between the sections. So that's a very big positive thing. The other thing is that just by changing the hues and the contrast of these, we were able to get it to pass the level of all levels, including the black and white. And that was the same for the blue as well. Okay, you can also see what all the colors now would look like. You can definitely tell that there's a distinction between the two as sections, and there's a higher contrast to the content on each area with regard to the text. So that makes it much more accessible. So that's kind of the overview of the color. So let's now talk about the text and text size. And like I was saying in the previous session for color, or section for color, most people do not understand the importance of color contrast. And that's because text size is actually determined by your contrast levels between your background and your foreground, which is your text on your overlay. And so in this example, I've basically just used this dark gray along with the color of this font, and I'm able to get all levels across the entire board. And so we're looking here, the first two levels are the minimum contrast levels that you have to meet the AA in order to go below an 18 point. And I'm emphasizing 18 point. And then this is for the AAA again, which is the enhanced contrast, which is for low vision users. And then this is if you're going to go over the 18, because that changes it as well. And then this is again over the triple for a low vision user. This one is if you basically get all the A, AA, and AAA, which honestly, AA and AAA should just be the standard. I personally think that AAA, because of where silver is headed, is where everybody needs to be designing for. And then this last one is regarding to your grayscale. And so this is a person that only sees in black and white. And so usually if you hit the mark of right at 500 with this specific contrast checker that I've used, and I will show you in just a second, you usually always get a green light. So recommendations with actual font sizes is that because it's specifically done on your contrast, kind of a base starting point to where it's easier, I should say, or lighter on the eyes, relaxes the eyes, is to always have headers that are no less than 16 points. You do see that in that approval that I just showed you, they emphasize an 18 point. And so if you go to 16 as a header is probably the lowest that I would go. And then your body, the recommendation is at 14 points. If you go to 12, that would be the absolute lowest that you should go. Otherwise, it really starts to put a cognitive load on your system for the user. Or not on your system, but on the user. And that can cause headaches, it can cause tiredness, it can cause a lot of different things. In addition, you always want to check the spacing requirements. That's one thing that goes along with the guidelines of the contrast is spacing. So you have to have a certain amount of space between the lines of text as well. As you've noticed, I have quite a bit of room between my information. So buttons in a system, also the contrasting of color plays the same role with text as it does with buttons. And so contrast and changing the actual state of a button when hovering or utilizing that button are critical to a low vision user. You want to have a definite contrast between changing the state from active to inactive and even including a hover. So throughout this presentation, there has actually been a multitude of different ways to present buttons where the context of the button clearly changes when either my mouse or the keyboard stroke moves to the button and activates it. You might not have noticed, but if you go back, there's a multitude. I have used all different kinds of different buttons of the way that they could look where a definite distinction has been made for a low vision user. And they all hit the AAA color contrast in every single button that is in this presentation. So tab control, which is also kind of known to users as folders, it's kind of the terminology that a user might use. But with regard to being a developer, the tab control is a tool that can be used inside a FileMaker to have different areas of content. And it can be really great. It's a widely used tool. I like it a lot, but I have seen that tab control has shown some difficulties for the keyboard only users while they've tried to maneuver between tabs. And so attention and testing should definitely be taken when you're working with tab control. Special scripting may be necessary to ensure that a user can get from one tab to another. That does lead me straight into sliders though, as an alternative if you cannot get the tab control to work. So talking about sliders as an alternative to tab control, sliders can create an amazing amount of depth of information on layouts and keep users very focused. Moving between multiple windows or tabs can be very difficult for individuals with accessibility needs and can cause them to lose their place or context. And so by using multiple layers of sliders combined with proper button and button bar scripting, you can actually reduce the amount of windows a user is required to manage or maneuver through, which can be really difficult for someone that is required to only use keyboard and does not have capability of using a mouse. Okay, so an example of this is that this actual presentation that you're watching is being presented using FileMaker. This whole presentation was designed in FileMaker, and there are a total of 33 layered sliders with a grand total of 164 slides on those sliders. And I'll show those to you in just a minute. So you never once in this presentation have been taken to another screen or another window. We have stayed on the same layout this entire time, and we have made an amazing amount of depth into one page. And we've also kept the user very focused, which is myself. An example of this is that using the layered slides and proper use of buttons has eliminated the requirement for using multiple windows, thus reducing user confusion and keeping the user on task, like I had just mentioned. So showing you as an example to that, in this system itself, I always keep a little bit of a hide. You can actually keep a table of contents for your system and the things that you're doing. You can do it not only for the layers, which this is a sample of, it's just a list of all the layers where everything is at. It not only as a designer keeps you on track of where everything is and what is layered on top of the other layer, but it also assists other developers as they come in, especially in systems where you might have somebody that specializes in just the UX and then another person just in the UI, and then you have somebody that just does the scripting, and you have lots of different people involved in a system. This can keep a really good consistency for everybody to know where things are. This is also a really good tool where you can actually create a table of contents of the rules that are applied per certain criteria based on certain pages, those kind of things. So just to show you that it is capable to do. And then lastly, let's talk about the more. There are definitely more areas to cover for accessibility, but this session was basically for you to be able to get an overall concept regarding making systems accessible for everyone. There's a ton more information, but the key takeaway for you right now is to remember that just like with any other designing and creating and developing systems, consistency is the key issue if you want to do accessibility well. And even Frank Spiller in Experience Dynamics just really pushes that home with people. So consistency is very, very important. So as we move into the testing area, I just want to first start it off by reminding you and emphasizing that just because you're hitting a particular accessibility guideline does not at all necessarily mean that you're serving a good experience to the person that needs the accessibility. So always keep that thought in your mind anytime that you are designing, developing, and testing a system. It's the user experience and the user testing that gives the ultimate yay or nay of it being accessible at the end. And so let's go through the following areas that should at least be evaluated as just kind of a baseline. Does not mean that it's all of them, but it'll just give you an idea to start with. And the first one is color contrast. And so color contrast testing is basically make sure that all of your background and foreground colors meet guidelines. We already went over that in the design area. The system that I would recommend using is the www.contrastchecker.com. And that is the one that I showed you that indicates a pass or fail on a level A and a AAA. And I would assume that that would also be updated and upgraded once the silver is released. The second is color blindness. So color blindness testing. With this, use color blindness simulators to check for any context or text that is lost due to incorrect color contrasting. So that goes back to the example of where it was the orange and the blue, and then when we looked at it from someone that has only the capability to see in black and white, they turned all one color. So you want to look to see if any of that is happening, and also if any of the context, like the text, the instructions, or anything like that also disappears, because that can happen quite a bit as well. And then tabbing. Tabbing is a common thing in FileMaker, and it's extremely critical for people that are visually impaired and require the keyboard to maneuver through and don't have mouse control or capability to use a mouse. And so making sure that everything is tabbed properly, and it's not just tabbed to make sure that you get to each field. If there is context and labeling that gives it context, then you need to also associate the tabbing to those as well, because remember, they cannot see instructions, and so, or they might not be able to see instructions, and so just getting them to a field is not enough if you're doing it in order. They need to have instructions, and so using your accessibility inspector, where you can label or give specific instructions and so forth, which you can find in the Claris resource for FileMaker, that's important to use. You're going to need to go and look at those things every single time. Tabbing is an absolute must and an absolute critical area, and that is also something that your user testing will want to go through to make sure that the context makes sense to them. Okay. And then readers. There's multiple readers available to individuals with disabilities, all of which read content differently. And I've said that a couple times in here. They all read differently, and so my recommendation is the reader mode, because 90% of the visually impaired community is using the web, and they're using the Chrome reader on Chrome, and then which also complies with the Edge for the Microsoft side of things. When you have 90% of the market of accessibility using that, that is definitely the direction that I would recommend going at this time, at least. And then preview and print. Preview and print mode has definitely shown some difficulty for the screen readers, and should definitely also be tested on all PDFs, Excel, and print options. So basically all PDFs and Excel exports should be readable by screen readers as well. Which requires that you also correctly do tagging with the accessibility inspector and tab order, and possibly even specialized grouping when it comes to creating documents that are going to be printed. So take special note to that. Special care usually is needed in that area. And then lastly, user testing. I can't emphasize enough. There's automated checkers here. And you yourself are a checker, but do not rely solely on the checkers. And as a non-visually impaired person, you do not and cannot be in a user's shoes that is disabled. And so there is not any checker which can replace an actual user testing by a person who is truly disabled and needs to have accommodations. We just can't, as much as we want to put ourselves in their shoes and we try to practice on a daily basis empathy, the reality is that we really in no way, shape, or form can finally get into their shoes. We can only do our best. And so the end user that needs to do the testing is an individual that does struggle with these impairments that you're designing for. So in the beginning, in the overview, I mentioned that I would be bringing you some resources. And so we're now to that area. And so here's some resources with regards to regulations. And there's really only 3 areas that I would recommend that you start getting and become familiar with. And that is the WCAG 2.1, which includes the 2.0. And that's at w3.org. And then also getting familiar with the Silver Roadmap and what's coming. And you can also find that at w3c.org and just type in Silver Roadmap, and it'll take you to some phenomenal information. They've got some really good PowerPoints and just really informative compared to what has been provided up until this point. So I think that you'll be really pleased with getting an understanding of what the future is, that it's not going to be as hard to understand as it has been in the past. And then also Section 508, that's in regard to anything for federal agencies. And so that's section 508.gov, and if you need to get any exceptions there and what your process would be. And then readers, like I mentioned, there's multiple readers, the primary one being Chrome Reader Mode that works on Chrome and Edge. And this is the one that 90% of the accessibility community uses. That's a large number, so I would tell you that if you're going to develop and test, I would recommend developing and testing against that criteria versus any of the others, if possible. But again, it'll depend on your specific client and what their needs are, what they're using the system for, and lots of different things you'll need to discuss there. But the Chrome Reader Mode is definitely the one that I would prioritize. The voiceover is another one that is specific to Apple and Mac, and that is on your desktop and also on your iOS. And then the narrator, which is for Windows and Androids, and both of those can be found in your settings. I actually would encourage everyone to go on your iOS and go into your settings and play around with your accessibility mode. It is quite interesting. If you really want to step into a place of empathy with somebody, go into your mobile device and turn on the settings for accessibility and play around, and it will be eye-opening for you. The last two are the NVDA and the JAWS, and those are the two readers that have been around the longest. The NVDA, I believe, is at no cost to a visually impaired or somebody that needs accessibility assistance, but the JAWS is quite spendy. It always has been, and based on conversations that I have had with individuals that are actually blind and are on the boards of the blind community and so forth, the JAWS has always been difficult for them, and it seems that JAWS isn't expiring itself, but the users are expiring it because there's so many, 90% are moving over to the Chrome Reader mode. When JAWS is already difficult for people to use, one of the blind individuals that I've talked to has said, that JAWS was actually more inaccessible than accessible when it was supposed to be the accessible piece. And so they're just not using it. Most people are not training people on JAWS anymore. It still is out there though, and some people that have used it for a really long time might need it. And so you still have to be aware of it, and you've got to know who your client and the audience is that you're working with. Color testing. This is another area where I would encourage you to step into the empathy place of taking a colorblind test. And Enchroma.com is a really great source for colorblind information. And they've got a really quick 5-minute online colorblind test, and it's really good. And then lastly, just use your contrast checker. And I already gave you that, which is contrastchecker.com. Besides that, those are just the places to start with. You can go as far as you want with understanding accessibility, but this is literally to give you starting points to get ready for where technology is moving forward to, so that we can all come together to do something. So in closing, and as a really brief recap of what we've just now discussed in this session, basically, there's new standards and regulations that are coming our way for accessibility. And so right now is the time to start getting educated about accessibility and giving it a seat at every table. I also invite you to join Claris's vision to help make powerful technology available to everyone. And then lastly, thank you for joining me today for Accessing the Cloud through Accessibility.